two things. First, we are going to talk about biological adaptations that cells, plants, animals have. And by cells, mostly I'm talking again about the microbes we talked about when we talked about biogeochemistry, have to have in order to live in a wetland environment. And then we're going to talk about wetland succession, how you go from open water, such as a lake or a coastal area, to terrestrial upland. So we'll do those two things. And let's see, this one is not a touchscreen. Okay. So this is really our last kind of technical, it is our last technical lecture on the chemistry, the biology of things. And I'm going to talk about it in a general sense, but then in the next couple of weeks when we talk about actual types of wetlands, we'll refer back to, so we don't have to deal with salt here, but we do have to deal with temperature. And so we'll apply what we learned in the next 2 weeks when we talk about coastal wetland systems and inland wetland systems. But as we've said all along, it's very difficult to live in most wetlands. We know from last week that there is a tremendous amount of anoxia. There's no oxygen, so the microbes have to develop ways of respiring without using oxygen. And it is also a situation where if you're tidal, like in the previous slide, you have anywhere from complete freshwater, half of a part per million of salinity, all the way up to 33 parts per thousand salinity at high tide. So it is the case that most animals and plants are uniquely adapted to one type of salinity. We'll use this when we talk about osmosis and diffusion. You know that if you go to the pet store and you have an aquarium, you may not buy a saltwater pretty fish and go home and put it in your freshwater aquarium. It doesn't work that way. Animals and plants are the same thing. If you had a saltwater plant, they would die if you throw them into freshwater aquariums. So these organisms have to have three essentially levels of adaptations to the wetland environment, and we'll go from a cell to a vascular system. So here we're talking about plants, we're talking about xylem and phloem and how they get their nutrients and their oxygen. And then we'll talk about animal adaptations. So first looking at the cell level, and I put just really simple things here. Anoxia, remember from the last couple of weeks, we have a situation where there's virtually no oxygen. So organisms cannot use O2, oxygen, as the terminal electron acceptor. The redox potential drops, and so you use other ions such as nitrate, manganese, iron, sulfate, and carbon dioxide in really aggressive cases. So that's how the cells adapt to anoxia, by using things other than oxygen. When we're talking about salt, salt is really difficult. When you have water permeable membranes, which are the cell walls of cells, they separate out solutions of different salinity levels, of unequal salinity. And the water molecules from osmosis, this is the Greek word which means to push, go from low salinity to high salinity. So they try to dilute the higher salinity concentration. And so you talk about osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure is the pressure that has to be applied to the higher salinity solution to prevent the passage of water molecules into the pure water. So salinity is tough. Again, here we have an overblown, but picture of a coastal ecosystem. Like we'll go to those of you who are around, and you see the ocean, and then you see a wetland that's a coastal wetland. That coastal wetland, again, can vary from 35 parts per thousand salinity to half of a part per thousand, which is essentially fresh water twice a day with the tidal cycles. And that's something that is incredibly difficult for organisms to deal with, which is why when we go to our first field trip, you'll see that there's just kind of one plant there. So what's in seawater? When we're talking about salinity, yes, we're talking about sodium chloride mostly. but we're also talking about smaller amounts of other things. And with this, you can hearken back to looking at the types of rocks that water passes through and dissolves, and bringing that chemical signature to a wetland. Here is what is dissolved essentially in seawater. And you see most of it is chlorine. There's some sodium. Another anion or negatively charged ion is sulfate. And so the sodium, the calcium, the magnesium, and the potassium all hook up with either chlorine or sulfate when they complex out and become rocks. But that's what's in water. And the rest of it is water, right? You have 965 and a half essentially grams per 1,000 grams or kilogram. That is pure water, which is good because organisms and the cells of organisms are essentially just little bags of water. This shows the water content of some wetland organisms, although humans, I don't know, weren't really wetland organisms, but we can get into a wetland. So osmosis is very important to wetland organisms because you have these cells that are semi-permeable membranes, and in the case of salinity, you have three conditions that you can reach. You can either be saltier than the water surrounding you. We'll look at fish. You can be less salty than the water surrounding you, or you can be the same salinity, which is energetically the most efficient. You don't have to go through any trouble, go to any trouble to adjust to salinity, just the same. So those three things, those three conditions for cells are iso. Iso means the same, right? So isotonic means that the ocean water is the same salinity as the organism. So there's no net transfer of salt because they're the same. The next is hypertonic. And what that means is that the water outside the organism is lower in salinity than the salinity inside the organism or the cell, because we're talking about a cellular level. Therefore, there would be net movement unless you do something to prevent it through the membrane into the cell, because water goes from lower to higher salinity. And the other type of organism or cell is called hypotonic. And in this case, you can see that the salinity inside the organism is higher than the water. That would be a freshwater fish. So unless you have some sort of adaptation, there would be net movement out of the cell. And again, going to osmosis, here's a picture. You can picture these being a fish or a cell in a wetland environment. You see the water molecules diffuse through that semi-permeable membrane in the center of these U-shaped columns, and the water goes from lower salinity to higher salinity. So think of it trying to dilute out the higher salinity solution. So there would be water, as you can see in the left-hand side, moving from the low side to the high side. So think about this in terms of the aquarium fish, right? If you have a saltwater fish, you are, well, I'll get to that in 2 slides, I'm sorry. Just for now, you have hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic. The adaptations that happen, here's the fish. The freshwater fish, one that is adapted only to fresh water, you can see they don't drink any water. They're hypertonic. So again, their salinity is higher inside their body than in the fresh water. So they don't drink because the tendency is for the water outside to go into them to dilute them. They also have special cells that absorb salt and concentrate it inside of their bodies. And they pass out large volumes of very dilute urine. So they're trying to get rid of the water and keep the salt. Hypotonic fish, marine fish, you would think they wouldn't drink because remember, hypotonic means that you have less salinity inside you than is outside. But what they do is they drink lots of water and then they secrete salt through these chloride regulating cells around their gills. And they also, it doesn't say here, but they also have highly, highly concentrated urine. So they're trying to get rid of as much salt as possible. So if you have a hypertonic freshwater fish and you throw it into a saltwater environment, what happens to it? Someone can unmute or you can type. It dies, yes, but what happened? Someone's typing, someone's typing. Keep typing. James is typing. Yeah, so think about it. You have a freshwater fish, you throw it into salt water. Now it has adaptations that are not working, right? So you have the fish being suddenly lower salinity than the outside. So because of osmosis, wanting to dilute the whole seawater that you put it in, what happens is the water leaves the fish and it shrivels up and dies. Don't try this at home. If you go buy a marine fish and you throw it into your freshwater aquarium, what would happen is the water would try to get into the marine fish to equalize out the salinity, and the adaptations that a marine fish has are not equipped to handle that. So the fish would get bigger and bigger and bigger until it explodes. So these are situations where the fish are uniquely adapted to very, very small ranges of salinity. And how do you get around the fact that these things are vacillating quickly? Here's another picture of showing hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic organisms, more or less from wetland environments. Some of these things, seals, right? They can go in, they don't have to. Manatees, they can be in mangroves. But you have in the um, top left the worm, the mussel, the octopus. What you're looking at is the freezing point of water, just regular water, versus the freezing point of the body fluid of these organisms. The higher the salinity, the lower the freezing point. So the top left is a situation where you have essentially isotonic, the same salinity in and out because the freezing point is the same. Over on the right-hand side, when you see the freshwater invertebrates, that is a hypertonic situation. The salinity inside the organism is greater than the salinity of the water in which they live. So they freeze at a lower temperature than water. And then the bottom one is hypertonic. So you have a situation that you have eel, carp, water snake, etc. In this case, you have the salinity in the organism more than the water. So they freeze at a lower temperature than water itself. If we put humans into seawater, we're about a quarter of the salinity of seawater, so we would shrivel up, do what that other fish would do, shrivel up. So wetlands, a couple of things to talk about here. This is one of my favorite things to talk about in wetlands. Wetlands are considered eurohaline, which means widely salty. And we have a situation where the salt changes rapidly because of the mix of fresh water and salt water. We're moving now to nutrients, though. What about nutrients? Where are the nutrients coming from? What is it that makes these wetlands so unbelievably productive? Even though, again, the salt marsh that we'll go to in a couple of weeks if you come is a very low biodiversity wetland. There's only a couple of types of species. It's 5 times more productive than a hayfield. So really, really productive. The reason for that is because they are able to get around the ocean paradox. Again, we're moving to nutrients here. Very simple block diagram to show the ocean paradox. At the top of the ocean, down to about 200 meters, you have a situation where there's high light. High light, and so there's organisms, there's phytoplankton. Per unit area, it's not a lot of productivity, but there's a lot of phytoplankton there. So highlight intense competition for nutrients, but not a lot of nutrients. So the upper part of the ocean, the photic zone, is severely nutrient limited. But those organisms are dying and raining down to the bottom of the ocean. And so at the bottom, you have the opposite situation. There's a constant rain of nutrients, of organisms that are being broken apart into abiotic compounds. So you have low light, but high nutrients. And since photosynthetic organisms are the base of the food chain, they can't live very well in either one of these. So that's the ocean paradox. Top, highlight, virtually no nutrients. Bottom, virtually no light, lots of nutrients. Now, because of the Coriolis force, Coriolis effect, if you know what this is, great. We go into great detail about it in physical oceanography, for example. You know that Earth is spinning, and it spins out from under airborne objects, and the ocean is considered, sort of an airborne object, used a fluid. And so it sets up these gyres in the major ocean basins where there is water swirling around. Because water comes up from the bottom, hits the continent, and then moves away in its essentially spiraling whirlpool at the coastal regions where all these wetlands are, you have a mixing for the first time in probably thousands of years of this vast body of ocean water, where you have upwelling, that's what upwelling is, of the water that's been accumulating nutrients for so long, there's nothing there to use the nutrients, into a photic zone, a place where there's light. And so you have huge amounts of productivity. Coastal wetland environments, estuarine environments are great places for productivity. They are the base of the food chain. So what you're seeing here is a false color coastal zone, and it shows the productivity. Red is the highest productivity, and when you get down to blue, there's virtually no productivity going on. So perhaps all is not bad in a wetland environment because, yes, you have fluctuations of salinity, fluctuations of oxygen, but you have a situation where you have high light, lots of nutrients, so incredible photosynthesis. When you have, and I'll show you phytoplankton in a minute, when you have these microscopic algal cells photosynthesizing like crazy, then you have a lot of zooplankton that's eating the phytoplankton, little fish eating the zooplankton, and it goes up the trophic level to bigger fish, to whales, etc. And so that's why wetlands are tremendous fish nurseries, breeding grounds, and good places to find organisms, because you have this huge sort of base of the food chain explosion of productivity, and everything hangs off of that. So let's see, I'm going to take a voice break and we'll open our first poll. Oh, wait, no, we can't. No, we can't yet. I didn't talk about this yet. So, sorry, false alarm. We talked about salinity briefly, and this is all in detail in your book. Now we can talk about nutrients, because we've established that there are a lot of nutrients, especially in coastal wetland environments, but also in most inland wetland environments, unless you're talking about a bog. And this is a great situation. And now instead of osmosis, we're talking about diffusion. And diffusion is kind of similar to osmosis, but it's driven by concentration gradients. And so now instead of the water moving, the nutrients or the dissolved substances move. And so this is a really neat picture, because what's happening is the nutrients in the seawater, there's suddenly a lot, are diffusing into the cell because of a concentration gradient. The concentration gradient exists because as soon as a nutrient goes inside the cell uses it up for its metabolic processes. So there's always going to be a concentration gradient of high nutrients outside, low nutrients inside the cell. So nutrients just diffuse in. A single-celled organism, a phytoplankton cell, does not have to do anything to get a constant, steady supply of nutrients, because abiotic processes of diffusion are working in their favor. So you take the nutrients, you use them in your metabolic processes, and in doing so, that generates waste. And so the yellow balls there are waste. And so again, you have this concentration gradient where there's a lot more waste in the cell than outside the cell. So the waste is constantly diffusing out, the nutrients are constantly diffusing in, and you just get to live happily ever after, especially if you're an isotonic organism. You stay in equilibrium with salt water, and you get all the nutrients you want, and you don't have to develop any sort of waste flushing. So that's really it for the cellular level. It's pretty simple. The three sort of summary points is that in a coastal wetland environment, water moves from low to high concentration through osmosis. And then nutrients move either into a cell or waste move out of a cell as a result of metabolic processes. And then the last thing is that, right, so I said both of those, waste molecules diffuse out of a cell. So we have a great situation in a wetland environment, a coastal environment, for cellular level. And I'll return to cellular level in a minute. These organisms that we're talking about, I'll show you some pictures of them. They're ancient and they're unchanged. They don't have to change. They don't have to evolve because they're highly successful at what they do. In staying simple, they essentially get to rule the world. So now we can go to a poll. Let's see. Well, I think we do 10 first and then 7. Okay. So here's a poll. Take a minute to answer this. Okay, one more. So whoever is still working, finish up and I will end that poll. Actually, while someone's still working, I think we can do, what did it say? No, not yet. Okay, now we have everyone, so I will end that poll. Okay. Thank you for those. Hide. Okay. So maybe we'll do quickly the vascular and animal adaptations, and we can take a break because I know you guys are coffee and tea people. So again, briefly, and we're going to apply this stuff to specific organisms in specific environments when we talk about wetland plants and animals and wetland environment. But when we're talking about vascular adaptations, we're talking about in animals, a circulatory system, so blood, and in plants, we're talking about roots. And what I'm talking about first really is plant-based vascular adaptations. And the first here is anoxia, and it's exactly the same as at the cellular level. If there's no oxygen to the roots, there is either no metabolism, the plant can't function, or you switch to anaerobic respiration. However, the difference here is that if you switch to anaerobic respiration and you are a plant, you start quickly building up toxic byproducts and you kill yourself. So instead of using other things like carbon dioxide and methane and iron to metabolize, wetland plants have developed structural adaptations that enable them to get oxygen where there is no oxygen to be had. So we'll look at something called parenchyma, and you'll see this in the next couple of weeks. The plants develop these air spaces in their roots and also in their stem. It feels really spongy. And then what happens is the plant will take oxygen out of the atmosphere from the aerial portion of the plant and shunt it down into the roots, which they don't really need oxygen and in the aerial portion because that's photosynthetic. They need carbon dioxide. But the plants have evolved. It's magical to also take up oxygen and shunt it down into the roots where there is no oxygen, and they're still able to respire. There are also some things that you'll see, including special organs. There are roots that are called adventitious roots, and they function in an oxygen-poor environment. You can elongate your stem, and that gets you more oxygen. Mangroves, we'll see in the red, white, and black mangroves, they have developed something called lenticels, which are these pores. You can see actual holes in the structured roots above the tide level. They also have long, spongy, air-filled submerged roots that get oxygen from either the stems or from the lenticels on the roots. Sometimes you'll see nematophores. It looks like a little dead piece of tree sticking up next to a healthy mangrove, but those are actually something called nematophores. They stick these projections up out of their roots, and those specifically are designed to take oxygen and shunt it down as well. Some plants can actually develop pressurized gas flow, which is humidity induced. Air moves from the aerial leaves, so you have the leaves above the wetland sediment and soil, and it's forced downwards. So this pressurized gas flow happens for figuring out anoxia. Salt, it's very similar to the cells. You can get osmotic shock, you can get salt toxicity that goes on that's avoided by something called active transport, which I'm sure you know is the opposite of osmosis. It takes energy and you're able to do the opposite of osmosis. Or they have developed barriers that are impermeable at the point where there's salt fluctuations. Or there are even plants that have developed specialized cells similar to the gill pores in fish that allow them to secrete salt. So they concentrate it and secrete it. These things take energy, but it's better than poisoning by salt. And so, yeah, we talked about photosynthesis is the way to get carbon dioxide to the photosynthetic portion of the plant. Animal adaptations, really neat. We're talking about a ton of animal adaptations for the next couple of months, really. And temperature. In general, when you're looking at a plant, an animal, the higher the temperature in which the animal lives, the higher the biological activity. So what that means is that they grow faster, they have a shorter life expectancy, they reproduce earlier and more frequently. And if they're in a low temperature, then what happens is they have low biological activity. They grow very slowly. They tend to have a longer life expectancy. They reproduce later and they reproduce less frequently. A neat thing, it's one of the neatest things about vernal pools. Here I put this frog here. And there are frogs and salamanders that need to grow up in a vernal pool. And they're in this race against the vernal pool drying up. And it's so neat. What they do is, as a tadpole, so a frog comes and lays an egg, the egg hatches into a tadpole. The tadpole is able to sense the temperature and also the next bullet down, the oxygen levels in that vernal pool. And if it's a big, deep vernal pool and it's a cool spring, then the vernal pool will stay for a long time, and the tadpole will take a really long time to develop into a frog. That makes a bigger, more robust frog that's later to mature and gets really big. But sometimes frogs lay their eggs in vernal pools that are small. And so the tadpole knows, and I don't mean that sort of an intuitive sense, but its body senses that the temperature is high, maybe it's a hot spring, and the pool is really anoxic, it's going to dry up soon. So the frog will undergo this really expedited um, more metamorphosis to a frog. But the problem here is that when the frog leaves the vernal pool, it's much smaller, it's more vulnerable, it's more open to predation, and it probably doesn't have much chance overwintering if it's a bad winter. So this plays into talking about climate change. I hope you enjoyed your 70-degree day today. I think some areas hit 71 in February. This is going to be potentially devastating to the animals of the vernal pools because these pools will dry up much more quickly, and the frogs and the salamanders won't have a chance to survive to adulthood. Salt, the salt. Oh, wait. So I was going to say a couple of other things about anoxia. When you have organisms, animals that that are exposed to variations in salt, because remember you're a haline. What? Oh, sorry, not salt. Anoxia. They can have specialized organs for gas exchange, and we'll look at some of those. They can develop an improved oxygen gradient across a membrane, so like a ciliating action. They have little tiny small hairs that enable the oxygen to go past their semi-permeable membrane and come in. They can have internal structural changes, so like a stronger heart. Frogs have very big, strong hearts relative to their size. They can actually have better respiratory pigments, so pigments in the blood that increase the oxygen carrying capacity, so they don't have to be getting as much oxygen because they're super efficient. And then what a lot of animals end up doing is a behavioral thing. They leave when the oxygen levels get too low. You can also leave when the salinity gets too high. We see this in the Gulf of Mexico, the dead zone in that area. The fish just leave. They don't stay there because they know they can't survive there. Their body senses they can't survive there. So let's see. I think I have feeding adaptations here. Um, these are polychaete worms on the left and right side. These are mud dwellers. And what they're able to do to survive in a wetland, and by this I mean eat to get their nutrients, they can actually, where there's not a food source that they get from their mouth, they can absorb amino acids through their skin. And that is made more efficient by mucus and then cilia. So sorry, that should say CILLIA, little hairs that move the mud around and they can absorb amino acids. So that's kind of a neat thing they can do. And behavior, again, talking about lifestyles. Um, these animals aren't necessarily obligate wetland species like a plant is, but there are a lot of animals that come into a wetland and eat the materials that the plants will create in a wetland environment. They also can fish there, such as the bear. Excuse me. They can get water there. So there are a lot of lifestyle adaptations that animals will undergo as a result of being near in a wetland. Another thing is, right, so fish and shellfish, if you're in a riparian wetland, so you have a river and then you have a flood zone that is a riparian wetland, what happens is the fish and shellfish move into the floodplain to feed, to spawn, and then they go back down into the river when the river water is lower. So this is similar to sort of a coastal wetland where you have a shallower, less fast moving, warm water environment where they can eat and where they can produce young, and then they go back into the raging river. We'll look at, I won't say much about this because we're already at 6:30. We'll look at these later, but there are a whole host of organisms that I hope we'll see, at least in part, when we go to Dorchester Bay. And these are organisms that live on the seafloor. They tend to be isotonic. They tend to be scavengers or decomposers. And then you have the pelagic organisms. So the benthos are the ones on the bottom. They develop specific adaptations to the fluctuations in the wetland environment. And then the pelagic environment are the free swimmers. And these are able to just come and go in response to their needs. So let me see. Size. Yeah, let me just finish these last three and then we'll take a break. Microscopic wetland life, I already talked about these, so I won't say too much more. Perhaps the best place to live is outside the ocean paradox, where there's high light, there's high nutrients. These organisms are ancient. They're old and unchanged. They don't need to change because they are highly successful, so they don't need to change. There's no reason to evolve. Phytoplankton are the plant-like cells, microalgae, and they are the things that are responsible for the oxygen that we animals breathe. So look at dinoflagellates and diatoms. And then zooplankton are the animal-like single cells or multiple cells, but microscopic. And these are either larval fish, larval eels, or, sorry, another type of radiolarians. Here's a picture of the phytoplankton. You see a lot of them have these long needle-like extensions. What this does is to increase their surface area. When you increase their surface area, you increase their resistance, and so they can float easier. They don't sink as much. The higher the surface area, the better able they are to float. So those are the phytoplankton. I have a cartoon diagram that shows coccolithophores. Those are just little calcium microscopic organisms. The diatoms, they make their shells with glass, so silica. And then dinoflagellates all have some sort of whip-like projection that enable them to live, go around in the ocean. Here's a zooplankton. You might see a clear picture of a larval fish top right. These are microscopic that will turn into a fish. And then some of the ones at the middle and bottom, larval shrimp, etc. So a lot of these are larval stages, but some of them are also just organisms that live and are able to stay very, very small. And the sizes of these are very small compared to the larger animals, larger plants. They don't get multicellular, again, because they are able to get everything they need in the shallow part in the coastal wetland, and they can just stay where they are. Yeah, all right. I won't finish this then, sorry. What I'm going to do is, it's 6:33. Why don't we, I'll say 10-minute break, but in that 10 minutes, I'm going to open up two more polls. And so take the 10 minutes. I won't talk for 10 minutes. I'll mute my camera. But by the time we come back at 6:44, please have filled out these next polls. Good? Okay, looks like there is one more person to finish the polls, and then we can move on. I'm going to end this one. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're good now, so I will end that and that. We'll have one more in a minute. So, clear this. Welcome back. Hope everyone got their coffee. We'll now hide. So much easier with the DA. So we're just going to stay with this notion of organism size for a while, because it may be that when you go on the field trips, if you want to, if you do, no problem. If you don't, but you may be struck by the fact that most of the organisms that we see or talk about in wetland environments are tiny. They are microscopic, and whether it's the bacteria in the subsurface or, more importantly, the phytoplankton in the water column. So they're super simple. They've stayed simple. They've stayed the same. I'm going to show you a quick calculation, nothing you need to do or work with, but show you a quick calculation why phytoplankton rule. They rule because they are small. In order to do the things that we talked about, stay in an isotonic situation with the salinity, and to get all the nutrients they need and to have the waste diffuse out of their system, they stay in the upper part of the ocean where there's sun and where there's nutrients. They can't swim because they're so simple. So what they do is to have a high surface area to volume or to body mass ratio. What that does is to provide a resistance to sinking. The higher the surface area, the more friction you have, and they want friction because they want to stay up in the upper part of the ocean. And because they have more surface area and more friction, they're able to do that. This is a picture that illustrates, I think, quite effectively why phytoplankton have stayed small. If you look at cube A, which is meant to show what a phytoplankton is doing, you have a cube, and they're not all cubes, but you have this cube, and the cube is 1 centimeter on each side. It's the linear dimension. So you have a square centimeter for each face. You have 6 faces, so the area is 6 square centimeters. But when you're calculating the volume, right, you multiply the width, length, and depth, and 1 times 1 times 1 is 1 cubic centimeter. So the ratio of surface area to volume, or to body mass, is 6 square centimeters to 1 cubic centimeter, or 6 to 1. Much more surface area relative to volume. So this has 6 units of surface area to every 1 unit of body mass. What if these phytoplankton were to get larger through time? They're very successful at what they do. So if they were to get larger, they were to evolve to be bigger and bigger through time, they might get to, and this isn't an unreasonable amount, 10 centimeters of the linear dimension of a cube. So we're approximating them with a cube. And what you can see is that the area now is 10 times 10, right? So 10 squared. And 10 squared 6 times is 100. 100 squared, 100 6 times is 600 square centimeters. But then when you multiply to get the volume, 10 times 10 times 10, you end up with 1,000 cubic centimeters. So when you do these simple calculations here that show the surface area to volume, surface area we calculated as 6 sides of 100 square centimeters each. So you have 600 square centimeters divided by 1,000 cubic centimeters, again, 10 times 10 times 10 to calculate the volume. You have only 6/10 of a centimeter to 1 cubic centimeter, or 0.6 to 1. So you see that you have really, really gone down in your surface area to volume ratio. And what that means, if you are a simple organism that wants to avail itself of the nutrients in by diffusion, waste out by diffusion, resistance to sinking, so you have the light, you have the nutrients, you can't evolve to be very big. So this is what happens. Again, you have this small size, and they just have remained unchanged for vast periods of geologic time. The opposite, when you're a big organism, when you're a fish, one of those fish that we looked at, and you want to be able to go where there is oxygen and where the salinity is suitable to you, and you don't want to be spending a lot of energy to go where you need to go. So those of you who have taken engineering or fluid mechanics know about this. The organisms that are swimming around in the ocean and in wetland areas coming in to feed or whatever, due to viscosity, the same thing that the phytoplankton want to have so they can be resistant to sinking, because of the viscosity, any body that's moving rapidly has to produce as little stress as possible as it displaces the water. So what you're seeing in the top part is a not very streamlined fish. It's parting the essentially layers of the water in such a manner that you're leaving this chaotic jumble behind you that drags you down. The one that looks like a sideways teardrop, if you will, is a much better situation. You part the water and then you enable it to come back together with very, very little turbulence behind you. So the phytoplankton want to be as resistant to shearing, as using of the friction as possible, whereas the larger organisms don't want to do that. But again, we talked about, kind of to summarize, we have these adaptations associated with either animal or plant situations in wetland environments. That includes temperature. That does impact the density of the water. The higher the temperature of the water, the less dense it is. So phytoplankton that live in the tropics have a harder time staying afloat than phytoplankton that live in the Arctic Circle, for example. It also will affect the amount of dissolved gases and may affect the salinity, but more it impacts the oxygen. Salinity, 35 parts per thousand, but it varies widely twice a day. Light, base of the food chain, we need to have light and nutrients together so that we can have phytoplankton living, and so the phytoplankton, again, need to be restricted to the upper part of the wetland environments, just in a coastal sense. Nutrients, we talked about how they dissolve gases. If you are microscopic, then you're able to have carbon dioxide and oxygen do the same thing that the waste and the nutrients did. So carbon dioxide will diffuse out of your cell if you are respiring because of the concentration gradients, and oxygen will diffuse in because of concentration gradients. If you are a photosynthesizer, the same thing, but in reverse. Carbon dioxide will diffuse in, that's what you use, and the oxygen, your waste product, will diffuse out. So there's a tremendous poetry associated with being a simple organism. And then we also just kind of did a cursory treatment of predator-prey relationships, how organisms feed. We will look more at things like mutualism and commensalism and all sorts of other behaviors when we get into specific wetland environments and when we do our day on wetland plants and animals. And then this is the last thing that we had discussed, right? Warm water is less viscous and cold water is more viscous. And then depending on who you are, what type of plant or animal you are, and what it is you seek to do in the wetland environment, you either want to be low or high surface area to volume ratio, or you want to be really streamlined so that you imagine if you have those projections that the phytoplankton have so that they're resistant to sinking, that would be a lot more difficult to move through the ocean if you're a big fish. And then pressure, I put this in, but pressure doesn't really play a big role in looking at wetlands because we never get that deep. But if you're talking about animal adaptations where you're a wetland larval stage, and then you go out into the ocean and you're migrating vertically, just like with salinity, organisms, or even more so really, organisms are adapted to a certain pressure. So the deep, deep, deep sea fishes stay deep, and the shallow fishes stay shallow. There's a lot of adaptations associated with migrating vertically. So the last part of today is wetland succession. And a hydrosphere rather, is a succession that starts in open water. We talked the first day of classes about how wetlands are transitional areas between open freshwater and dry land. Not always, but frequently. And so this is a wetland is an excellent place to see several stages of wetland succession all at the same time. When we go to Ponkapog Bog, we'll see if you come to all of these different stages all at the same time. In time, again, an open area such as a freshwater lake will dry out. Will it dry out? It will fill in, leaving an upland system, leaving a woodland. And during this process, from open water to upland environment, there are a number of habitats that will succeed each other or replace each other. So, excuse me, a marsh will become a swamp or something like that. And the succession from open water to climax woodland is likely to take 1,000 years, at least 200 years, and this depends on the temperature, the growing season, etc. Can take multiple thousand years, depending on the size of the water body, what's growing there, how long is the growing season. It depends also to a great extent. So Kenya, good question, on the amount of siltation that occurs. It doesn't happen. Kenya, it is the lowest threshold. And people always want numbers, right? They want, how long does this take? And it's very difficult to say how long this takes because what type of wetland are you talking about? Are you talking about a tiny, small vernal pool? So in that case, it is technically open water and it will dry out and become upland, albeit on a seasonal basis, in 3 months. So when we're talking about a decent size lake that will turn into upland environment in a warmer climate with a lot of mountains around it, because siltation is really important too. If you're in, we'll talk about prairie potholes, really flat areas, there's no sediment that's pouring into them. That will take a lot longer than if you have around us, right? You have these hills everywhere, and the hills and slopes are eroding, the soil is eroding, the rocks are eroding, and that's pouring siltation, it's called, pouring sediment into the wetland along with the fact that the plants are growing. So it's really difficult to say it takes this long, whether you're talking about a rate, 3 inches per year that it fills in, or whether you're talking about how long until it completely fills in. It's difficult to say, but a small wetland at a good clip takes 200 years for the lake to fill in and become a forest. And it could, for the big, huge things, no problem. The big, huge lakes in the middle part of the continent during the last glaciation, those took 15,000 years to fill in and become wetland. So it's tough. Maybe I shouldn't have even brought up the notion of time, but several thousand years is what we're looking at. So here, kind of an unspectacular picture of open freshwater, right? Deep water as you know, when we looked at those pictures the first day of classes, won't support rooted submerged plants because there's not enough light for photosynthesis in those depths. So there's microscopic organisms and some plankton floating in the open fresh water. That's stage one, essentially. Yeah. So yeah, 200 years kind of very, very fast. The next thing that happened, if you let the fresh water, open water rather, sit there for a long time, and the phytoplankton and floating plants will be sinking down to the bottom of the lake, making the water more shallow, and then also sediment again is coming in around the edges. Over time, again, the sediment's transported to the lake, and the phytoplankton raining to the bottom of the ocean. Also, streams can come in, bringing lots of sediment. So when there's lots of sediment, it can be deposited, and you end up with the water depth of that open water gradually decreasing. And this allows for the eventual establishment of rooted submerged plants. These are starwort, pondweed. You see a lily pad over there, and these things grow. Water lilies are rooted. They have floating leaves. And then you have, again, these other ones, the starwort and pondweed. Side note, those of you who have or are in New England, you can't really throw a stone without hitting a lake or a wetland around here. And I was looking for a house. I decided I wanted a house on a lake as a summer place. And it was teaching this class called Water Resources. And I thought, wow, I have all these MLS sheets, and I want to pick because I'm smart, I'm a hydro person. I wanted to pick the house that was not necessarily the most beautiful house, but the house that was on the best lake, the highest quality lake that's going to be there, that's going to be of good quality, and is going to just not be a mud puddle, as I like to call it. So I had the students, and full disclosure, I told them this is what I'm doing, but there's great value in this. I gave them each an MLS sheet for a house on a different lake that is undergoing this hydrosphere, this succession, and said to them, you are the consultant. So look at flood hazard maps, look at the quality of water in this wetland. Was it used for industry anywhere? Look at how deep the water is, look at the sedimentation rate, look at all of these things and decide, as the person that I'm contracting, is this a good investment? Is this lake house on a lake that is healthy and that will stay for a while, or is it filling in rapidly, as happens at an expedited rate when there are houses on the lake, because they're pouring also in lots of nutrients from their mostly improperly functioning septic system. So of these 6 properties I was looking at, and the students did this evaluation, 0 of the students recommended that this house be purchased because the lakes around here are ringed by wetlands. You have hyper-eutrophication, so lots of nutrients going into the situation, into the wetland, filling in super rapidly, and people sometimes do things to dredge, or they put in copper to kill some of the phytoplankton, but they're filling in, and they're filling in very quickly. So let that be a lesson to you. If you're looking for a house on a lake, don't buy one around here. So really, really bad situation with regards to lakes filling in super fast around here. I was going to say something else about that. It had to do with the field trip. Oh, yeah, so the Back Bay Fens, right? That's an altered, constructed wetland, but there's a lot of sediment coming off the riverway and all of the roads that ring the fens. So sediment is pouring off. They have these hay bales to try to keep the sediment off of the fen, but they're not working that well. You have geese there. So instead of it having a lot of nutrients from humans, yes, there's lots of settlement there, but we have sewer. So that all goes out to Deer Island. But the geese are there adding nutrients like crazy. There's phragmites like crazy, 18 feet high phragmites. And so the fens are filling in at an unbelievable rate. So we'll look at that as well. Those who can't come, I will put a thorough field guide, including pictures, online in case you want to flip through it. So this is part two, when you have submerged plants and the vegetation holds more and more of the incoming sediments. You have this mat of sediment and excuse me, sediment and plants. When the shallow lake fills in even more, then you end up with a swamp. And by this stage, the water may be too shallow to support fully submerged plants. So now you get emergent vegetation, roots underwater, but you see the plants are sticking out. You have here yellow iris is the bottom left-hand picture. Branched furread is the second picture in the foreground. You have reed mace in the back and cattails, I think, on the right-hand side. These are rooted underwater, but they are emergent. They tend to have tall, very flexible, kind of spear-shaped, flat leaves. And what that does is it enables the plant to cope with these large fluctuations in water level, always retaining some part of the leaves above water for effective photosynthesis. So the water can come in and out and just kind of goes around them. So continuing with the swamp, we're still sticking with the swamp here. The water in swamp areas tends to just absolutely teem with invertebrates. It provides also a lovely place for frogs to spawn. So there's a lot of life in this swamp water. It doesn't look lovely to you, but I think those are frog eggs in the left-hand side. I can't remember where I got that picture from. The leaf bases of the swamp plants, as you can see in the right-hand side, are extremely effective at retaining incoming silt, particularly in the winter when the leaves have died back. So you have this rotting vegetation that progressively builds up and it entrains the sediment, and so the ground will build up. The ground level will build up and up and up. And after the swamp, you end up with a marsh. And the swamp plants that are adapted to grow in partially submerged conditions will gradually die out as there's no more standing water. And then you have things like some grow equally well in both. So that previous picture of a yellow iris, it can grow in standing water. It can grow in a marsh situation. It will continue to grow. But then you'll have things like marsh mint, which is on the left-hand side. There are plants that are now, there's water right beneath the surface, but it's not the standing ponded water that may be coming and going laterally associated with either tides or with an adjacent river. So there we go. The frogs like to be in marshes because they are in a protected environment. They're small. They're still kind of vulnerable to predation. So marshes are good places for them, but in a way that the vernal pools may be drying out faster than they need. But there are snakes and other things that come into the marsh as well to look for these organisms. Grass snakes like to come look for frogs to eat. So let's move to the next one. Now you're having a wetland that has more trees. It's starting to become more of a forest. The soil's still wet, but it's no longer completely waterlogged, and it's no longer completely anaerobic. So now the soil will have some oxygen in it. Willow has grown. Willow is one of the first things to invade into a hydrosphere, and it will grow up and it will dominate the ground. And willows will maintain a big diversity of invertebrates. It's been cataloged around here that more than 450 invertebrates, or bug species, congregate around the roots of a willow. So there you have a lot of invertebrates. That makes for a lot of good food for insectivore birds. So that's why there's a lot of birds in these types of wetlands, because there's tons of bugs, tons of invertebrates for them to eat. Alder is another tree that flourishes in these wetlands, these almost towards climax wetland, and they can be there. And some of the marsh plants that had been there are now starting to be shaded out by the alders and shaded out by the willows, and so they kind of go away. And these are some of the plants that you would find here. On the left-hand side, you have star sedge. Then you have, over on the right-hand side, you have mushrooms, right? You have these fruiting bodies. In drier climates, the wetland here will be more of a decompositional environment, and it will add a lot of nutrients to the soil. And the last thing that happens is you now have a true dedicated climax woodland. And in a climax woodland, you have more species of trees, including things like oak and ash and beech. They're slow growing because they're tall. I know. Oh my God, that's so funny you said that. Bugs delicious, Kenya. So tomorrow morning I teach a course called Eating in the Environment, and I was telling them, total side note, but I see your bugs thing. I was telling them how bugs are a high quality source of protein, higher iron content, higher calcium content than meat that we eat around here. Yeah, lots of protein, also calcium and iron, higher in calcium and iron. Yeah, Joe, exactly. So that's what I'm bringing to my class tomorrow morning. I have this big bucket of crickets for them to eat. I've not eaten tarantula. I had a tarantula as a pet when I was little, but I never ate one. I see them. I see scorpions and that sort of thing in candy. But anyway, yes, bugs are fabulous, and people should eat them. I know, no, I'm not going to eat that. Yeah, I have the students in this class eat crickets, grasshoppers, and grubs. And there's a restaurant in New York City. I don't know if it's still open, but I was reading about it a couple of years ago. It is haute cuisine. It's really high-end cuisine, and they start you off. It's a prefix menu. They have these courses. They start you off with a land shrimp cocktail, and the land shrimp cocktail is it's served on shaved ice, and you have the cocktail sauce in the middle, and around the glass are the land shrimps, which are big grubs. Yeah, and yeah, Nandini, I don't know. Joe, ants have formic acid in them, which is very similar to citric acid. So ants taste like lemon or lime. So yeah, bugs, good thing to eat. Highly, highly sustainable. Not a part of our wetland class, but definitely a part of sustainability. So anyway, I'll try to remember to bring some for those of you who are coming on the field trip. I'd get oh, that's cool, Joe. Honey sac. I'll have to look that up. Honey ant. That's really cool. All right, last slide. Keep typing. I'll read this after. We're far afield, and that's, I guess, okay. But the to not break the flow, the climax woodland. Again, you have these older plants or trees rather that are slow growing, and they're tall and long lived, and over time they will come to absolutely dominate the area. Particular trees that dominate tend to be mixed oak, and so then you have a whole different woodland community. You see that there's mice,